find leads to a monumental discovery. God's Providence in the Return of the Bradford Journal by Scott Miller. How thankful we should be that the record of the establishment at Plymouth was faithfully penned by William Bradford. A Pilgrim classic, in fact, the first American classic. The history of Plimoth Plantation stands alone as a literary testimony to the uniqueness of the Pilgrim character, which combined qualities of courage and independence with Christian charity and forbearance. Americans long familiar with the more prominent Puritan writers in our heritage are drawn to the classic simplicity and dignity which characterized the one small candle lighted by the noble governor. This declaration was made in the introduction of the little book entitled The Hand of God in the Return of the Bradford Manuscript to America, written and compiled by Verna M. Hall and Rosalie J. Slater in 1971. It is a booklet compiled for the 350th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. The facts in this presentation of the loss and eventual return of the Bradford Journal are largely drawn from this compilation. Imagine walking into a bookstore, not unlike the one at Wright, and picking up a book that catches your eye. Then, imagine leafing through the pages of this recently published book, only to find a quote that came from another book so rare that there is only one copy of it in the world. A book that has been lost to the world for over 80 years. That is exactly what happened in 1855. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Today, when we read of Plimoth Plantation written by Governor William Bradford, we almost take it for granted that we've always had the first and most complete record of the Pilgrims ever written. In fact, there was a very long period when no one knew the whereabouts of his journal. It was effectively lost to history for at least 80 years. The common histories of the Pilgrims written during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, such as Magnalia Christi Americana by Cotton Mather or New England's Memorial by Nathaniel Morton, were derivative of other works and merely quoted passages from the Bradford Journal. Because there was no complete history of the separatist movement and the Pilgrim history in the New World, as the years passed by, the story of the Pilgrims and the little colony faded more into the bygone past. Yet, at one of the most crucial periods in our nation's history, Providence allowed this jewel to be rediscovered to inspire a nation about to go through the most trying time in our history, Civil War. What necessitated its writing? Of the original 102 passengers that arrived aboard the Mayflower in 1620, by the time of the first Thanksgiving 1 year later, only 47 survived. In the ensuing years, several other ships, such as the Fortune in 1621, the Anne in 1623, the Little James in 1623, and the Charity in 1624, arrived at Plymouth, enlarging the population significantly that had been depleted that first hard winter. The colony was becoming firmly established on the American continent. A note on one of the letters found in his letter book states that as early as 1625 or 1626, just a few years after the landing of the Pilgrims, Governor William Bradford began to contemplate his and the colony's place in history. By this time, other ships, sent by Thomas Weston of the Merchant Adventurers, began to ply the waters of Massachusetts Bay, sent to establish other colonies in the Weymouth and Boston areas. He started writing his manuscript in 1630. Governor Bradford stopped writing his journal about 1650, and he indicated that he wanted to continue writing, but he died in 1657 before he could resume. Appended to his work, The History of Plimoth Plantation, are notes written by those to whom the volume was bequeathed. It passed from Governor Bradford first to his son, Major William Bradford, down to his son, Major John Bradford, and it finally was passed down to his son, Samuel Bradford, about 1705. Over the subsequent years, the manuscript was quote, lent, unquote, out to several historians who were writing books about the early American and colonial history. And it was lent with the full expectation that it would be returned to the Bradford family upon request. Through the ensuing years, there were other important writings that borrowed heavily on the Bradford Journal. We still rely on them today to fill in some of the gaps that were not captured in the Bradford Journal. However, the Bradford Journal is the only one written during the first years of the colony, from 1620 through 1647. And it is the most complete telling of the history of the separatist movement beginning in England in 1602 to their 12 years in Leiden, Holland, and finally on to America. The first person known to have borrowed the manuscript was Nathaniel Morton, Governor Bradford's nephew. He borrowed it so that he could write his book, New England's Memorial, first published in 1669. The first miraculous protection. One must remember that there was literally only one copy of the Bradford manuscript. So in order for the earlier colonial historians of the 17th and 18th centuries to glean facts from it for their writings, it had to be physically passed from person to person. It was thus subject to loss or destruction while in the possession of these authors, since in some cases they kept it in their possession for years at a time. The first known instance where we could have lost it forever was while in Nathaniel Morton's possession. Actually, he lent it to Reverend Increase Mather of Boston after he asked to borrow it for one of his writings in 1676, and Nathaniel blithely let him borrow it. While in Reverend Mather's possession, a great fire occurred in Boston on November 27, 1676. The manuscript miraculously survived the fire since Increase Mather's home, possessions, and half of his library were destroyed. It was soon returned to Nathaniel, where he used it in another one of his writings in 1680. Following that, it appears to have been returned to Major John Bradford, undoubtedly with the smell of smoke still on it. At some point in the early 1700s, Major John Bradford lent the volume to Judge Samuel Sewall for research. And then in 1728, the manuscript was requested of Major Bradford by Mr. Thomas Prince, who was writing his chronological history of New England. Major Bradford informed him that it was in the possession of Judge Sewall, and he was given permission to retrieve it from him. Thomas Prince was creating a research library located in the Old South Church in Boston, which he called the New England Library. He noted at the time that he had borrowed it from Mr. Bradford on a blank leaf within the manuscript, and that, quote, John Bradford signified his willingness to lodge the manuscript in the New England Library, only that he might have perusal of it while he lived. So there it was with the bats in the belfry, so to speak. And also housed at the Old South Church was Governor William Bradford's letter book, which contained all of the correspondence that he retained between he and the separatists in Holland and England, and with Thomas Weston and the others from the merchant adventurers. So, it was with the full intent of the Bradford family to have these volumes returned to them upon the death of Thomas Prince. However, when he died in 1758, the whole library was bequeathed to the church under the care of the deacons. The Bradford history was not referred to again until 1769, when Dr. Ezra Stiles, president of Yale, referenced it in his writing, Ecclesiastical History of New England. The last time the Bradford manuscript was ever referenced was in 1773 by Dr. Ezra Stiles. So, where did it go? It is interesting to note that there is no one who really knows what happened to the Bradford manuscript after that. Somehow, it disappeared. In fact, in the 1826 edition of Dr. Prince's Chronological History, it mentions that the Bradford manuscript had been lost or destroyed in the Revolutionary War. One theory was that it had been taken by then colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was forced to flee Boston in 1774 before the British general Thomas Gage took control of the wayward colony. After he fled, many of his effects were sent to England. It is thought that amongst the shipment was his library that also contained books he borrowed from the Old South Church when he was writing his own history of the Massachusetts colony. So what became of the Old South Church? During the British occupation of Boston from 1775 to 1776, the British cavalry gutted the Old South Church and used it as a stable and riding arena for their horses. During this time, the library located in the tower was rifled through and obliterated. Hence, another theory is that the Bradford manuscript was amongst some of the booty that was looted during the British occupation of Boston. Its value would have been immediately observable to anyone who may have found it. One fact that gives credence to the theory that the Bradford manuscript was taken by a British officer or soldier out of the country was that the Bradford letter book disappeared too. And it was discovered in Nova Scotia in 1793, the pages being used to wrap meat and fish. It was returned to Boston that year. No telling how many pages of valuable letters were destroyed by someone's purchase of filet mignon or rock cod. In any case, the newly formed nation, after the Revolutionary War, mourned that it had lost the only complete history of its founding from 1620 to 1647. However, every American historian did their best to locate it, if it still existed, that is. And as late as 1830, Francis Baylis, in his historical memoir of New Plymouth, said that it is lost and no trace of it remains. As the Puritan New England grew in prominence, the Pilgrim, separatist colony in Plymouth became more and more diminished. Some did seek to revive their resolute spirit, but it was usually short-lived. During the Revolutionary War, demoralized troops and the populace looked again to the intrepid Pilgrim spirit. And President George Washington consequently revived the celebration of Thanksgiving following the war. In 1820, the great orator and statesman Daniel Webster gave a lengthy speech at Plymouth during the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims, that briefly revived the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock in the collective memory of the nation, and sought to place their accomplishment in its historical prominence where it needed to be. However, having lost the one and most complete history of the separatist movement and Pilgrims, their story was never as prominent or miraculous as it should have been for the new nation as it gained its footing in the world. In January or February 1855, Mr. John Wingate Thornton, a historian from Boston, was perusing through the books at a bookstore and discovered a volume written by then Bishop of Oxford, Reverend Samuel Wilberforce, called The History of the Protestant Episcopal Church in America, written 11 years before in 1844. Leafing through the volume, Mr. Thornton noticed some quotes that struck him as odd. Having read all of the other volumes regarding the Plymouth colony and the Pilgrims, these quotes added new facts and were written in the unique style of William Bradford. Bishop Wilberforce also wrote that he gleaned these facts from a manuscript being held at Fulham Palace in England. Could these have come from the missing Bradford history? Mr. Thornton bought the book and took the volume and presented it to a good friend of his, Reverend John S. Barry, who was about to go to print with his new book, History of Massachusetts. Upon inspection, Reverend Barry immediately recognized that the new facts presented in the Wilberforce book could only have come from the long-lost Bradford history. He read further and likewise noticed in the volume that Bishop Wilberforce mentioned the manuscript being held at Fulham Palace. Providence had indeed guided Mr. Thornton to go to the proverbial haystack which contained the needle, Burnham's Antiquarian Bookshop in Boston. Overcome with excitement, within just 2 days, Reverend Barry contacted a few others about it. In particular, he brought it to another prominent historian of the day, Mr. Charles Dean, and inquired if he could write to someone he knew in England who had contacts at the Fulham Palace to secure a copy of the manuscript. Wouldn't you know, there'd be early drama in the discovery. And interestingly, the fact that Reverend Barry approached Mr. Dean about acquiring a copy of the manuscript from Fulham Palace without telling his friend John Thornton about it caused a permanent rift in their relationship. Mr. Thornton felt that he found the manuscript and he should have been consulted prior to approaching others about it. Ultimately, he did not want to share credit for the discovery with Reverend Barry and Mr. Dean. Mr. Dean did write to England to ascertain if the manuscript was truly the missing Bradford history. In the meantime, Reverend Barry added some of the new facts discovered from the Wilberforce book to his own history of Massachusetts that soon went to print. This exacerbated the rift between he and Mr. Thornton. Mr. Dean wrote to his acquaintance in England who inquired of Fulham Palace, and did come to the conclusion that it was truly the lost Bradford history. He arranged for a handwritten copy of the manuscript to be made. It was finished by mid-July 1855 and arrived to our shores on August 3rd that year. It was immediately taken to print by Mr. Dean and was published in April 1856 by the Massachusetts Historical Society. An interesting point needs to be made. England had no idea we were looking for the Bradford history. Only to us in America was it lost without a trace. They had it safely tucked away in the library of the Fulham Palace since 1775 or 1776. There had been clues dropped since the 1844 publication of Wilberforce's book that the manuscript existed, but no one seemed to pick them up. It took 11 years for it to finally be discovered in that Boston bookstore. The copy that was published by the Massachusetts Historical Society was not quite complete. That was not the fault of the Society or of Mr. Dean, and it would not be discovered for another 40 years that Governor Bradford had written on the backs of some of the pages when he remembered certain events that were not included in the original telling of the story. Those are not included in the copy provided to Mr. Dean. Also, it lacked any of the illustrations, poetic structure, or Bradford's Hebrew alphabet and translations. At right is the cover page of that document that was produced by the Massachusetts Historical Society, History of Plimoth Plantation by William Bradford, the second governor of the colony, by Charles Dean. And it returned home at an opportune time, because many have thought that the return of the copy of the Bradford history in 1856 was another act of God's providence. By this time the country was divided over who really founded the nation. Was it the slave-holding South at Jamestown, or the Puritan and free North at Plymouth? The newly rekindled interest in the Pilgrims of Plymouth brought on by the recently published Bradford history validated the Norse contention that the nation was truly founded by the Pilgrims, rather than in the South at Jamestown. The nation was also deeply divided over the issue of slavery. Abolitionism in the North was taking hold. In 1858, just 2 years after the Bradford history was published, the Republican Party was created on the abolitionist platform. The Pilgrim story was incredibly moving and gave moral strength to the movement. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican president. That same year, the first petition to return the original manuscript of Bradford was made to the Church of England. And in 1863, President Lincoln established Thanksgiving as a national holiday for the entire nation on the last Thursday in November, hearkening back to that first Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims. So now the long odyssey of the return of the manuscript begins. As you'll recall, the first request to return it to our homeland was in 1860. And you would think that it would be pretty simple to have the Bradford manuscript returned to its rightful home. But as you'll see, it was anything but simple. Little more than 1 month after President Lincoln was inaugurated, the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter that started the Civil War in April 1861. Understandably, the goal of acquiring the manuscript was put on hold. In fact, it was not until 1869 that another formal request was made. That year, Mr. John Motley, ambassador to England, made a plea that because the library at Philadelphia had just graciously returned precious documents relating to the Crown as an act of goodwill, he requested that the Church return Bradford's journal as an act of reciprocity. But the answer was that a formal act of Parliament must be passed in order for the log of the Mayflower to be returned, and Mr. Motley was recalled to America before that act could be presented to Parliament. The log of the Mayflower? You will notice that the name of what we've been calling the Bradford Journal or Bradford History was suddenly changed by the Bishop of London to the Log of the Mayflower. It appears that their reluctance in returning the journal outright to each of those who requested it was because those in Fulham Palace considered it their property, due to the fact that it contained the official records of the passengers of the Mayflower, and all of the records of births, deaths, and marriages of those passengers, all of them British subjects. The Church of England was the official repository of all of the vital documents of the entire Commonwealth, including the colonies. This may explain why the Bradford Journal ended up at the palace in the first place. If they returned the journal to America, now a different country, they would be relinquishing those records too. After John Motley's return, interest waned in trying to acquire the manuscript. And believe it or not, it was England that started the process again. It was not until 1881 that got things restarted in England. After the assassination of President Garfield, the British people felt great sympathy for America, and it was proposed by Mr. Benjamin Scott, the Chamberlain of London, that it was a fitting moment to make restitution by returning the manuscript. This renewed interest, however, did not see the return of the Bradford manuscript because there was not the will nor leader to fully see the process through. Enter U.S. Senator from Massachusetts George F. Hoar in 1895. He himself was a historian and member of the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. Upon the 275th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, he was stirred to read the Bradford history that was published in 1856 for a speech he was going to deliver at Plymouth on December 21, 1895. At that time, he became convinced that the original manuscript must be returned from England. Finally, with Senator Hoar's leadership, he was able to muster all of the necessary resources and focus to see to it that the Bradford manuscript be once again returned to American shores. In September 1896, Senator Hoar made a formal request during a visit to England to Bishop Temple at Fulham Palace. He was told that possibly only a formal petition of the Queen would be necessary to see it restored. Upon his return to the U.S., Senator Hoar immediately started to work on a formal petition. It took no less than committees appointed by the American Antiquarian Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Pilgrim Society of Plymouth, the New England Society of New York, and acting governor of Massachusetts, Roger Wolcott, to make this formal petition via letters delivered by the U.S. Ambassador to England, Thomas Bayard, to the Bishop of London and the Archbishop of Canterbury in November of 1896. But not so fast. Upon this formal petition, the bishop decided that the matter of the log of the Mayflower should be adjudicated by the Ecclesiastical Consistory Court of London. The judge of this court was effectively the Vicar General of the Church. His rulings were final on any matter presented to him. This matter was represented in the court by Ambassador Thomas Bayard. However, sometime during the proceedings, Ambassador Bayard went on a trip to Italy. And though the court did agree to its return, as a result of Mr. Bayard's absence, what occurred in the final outcome turned out to be a misunderstanding by the court as to whom the document should be returned to. It determined that it should be transmitted, quote, to the President of the United States and the Senate of the United States of America, unquote, whereas the original request was that it be returned to the Massachusetts State House. Unfortunately, there was no formal way for that decree to be realized. As Senator Hoar explains, there was no way known to our constitutional proceedings by which the President and Senate could jointly take custody of such a document. So as a result of the misunderstanding, Senator Hoar had to make haste in getting both the President of the United States and U.S. Senate to pass a resolution directing where the log of the Mayflower be delivered to and by whom, before they went on their year-end recess. Unfortunately, in the interim, Ambassador Bayard was to be recalled, and the new ambassador to England, Mr. John Hay, was awaiting formal credentials to be presented to the Queen and was still in New York. Senator Hoar quickly wrote to the now former Ambassador Bayard and implored him to stay long enough in England to bring home the Bradford manuscript before returning to the U.S. In the meantime, the Consistory Court determined that the log of the Mayflower could be returned to the U.S. on the following conditions. One, that 2 photocopies of it had to be made for safekeeping at Fulham Palace and the Bishop of London's Registry in Doctors' Commons, in order to retain the registry of the births, deaths, and marriages of the Plymouth colony, which is the sole responsibility of the Church and ecclesiastical court to retain. And 2, only former Ambassador Thomas Bayard could transmit the document to the Massachusetts State House, upon his certification that this solemn task was to be undertaken with utmost care, and that it would be presented directly to the appropriate parties upon his return to the U.S. And, as if we wouldn't know what to do with it once we got it, the court laid out other specific instructions as to how it should be treated once it was conveyed to our shores. Namely, that it be open to all to read and appreciate. And they also wanted us to have it for genealogical research purposes. So once the photocopies were made and the certification was drawn up, the final disposition of the Log of the Mayflower was made by the court and Bishop of London on April 12, 1897. Former Ambassador Bayard took possession of it and returned to America. He presented it to Governor Roger Wolcott and before a joint session of the Massachusetts House and Senate, with many dignitaries and citizens present for the ceremony of the long-lost Bradford history of Plimoth Plantation, on May 26, 1897. It had returned home after more than 120 years of being lost. The General Society of Mayflower Descendants was established that same year in 1897. The first edition of the printing of the complete Bradford history appeared in 1898, to much anticipation and excitement of the nation. According to the recently published documentary, The Pilgrims, on PBS's American Experience program, the physical return of the Bradford manuscript was particularly monumental for the nation. Quote, "When the text itself returned, it was a scriptural event, and it came back with such ceremony and such gratitude and such honor that the history was coming home again, so that it was another kind of plantation, re-implanting that first history in its home and nationalizing that story," unquote. And, quote, "The Pilgrim story was complete. The journey was over. And the Pilgrims themselves, 250 years on, prevailed. Somewhere, William Bradford might have smiled," unquote. During the ceremony, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts George F. Hoar gave a lengthy speech upon the return of the Bradford manuscript to the Massachusetts State House. And he gave particular praise to former U.S. Ambassador to England Thomas F. Bayard for finally seeing to it that the manuscript was returned to its rightful place on American shores. Here are a couple notable quotes from his speech. "I do not think many Americans will gaze upon it without a little trembling of the lips and a little gathering of the mist in the eyes as they think of the story of suffering, of peril, of exile, of death, and of lofty triumph which that book tells, which the hand of the great leader and founder of America has traced on those pages. There is nothing like it in human annals since the story of Bethlehem. Massachusetts will preserve it until the time shall come that her children are unworthy of it. And that time shall come never." And as Governor Roger Wolcott received the Bradford manuscript physically in his hands, he exclaimed, "In this precious volume which I hold in my hands, the gift of England to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is told the noble, simple story of the Plimoth Plantation. In the midst of suffering and privation and anxiety, the pious hand of William Bradford here set down in ample detail the history of the enterprise from its inception to the year 1647. From him we learn, quote, that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties and must be both enterprised and overcome with answerable courages," unquote. As the official representative of the Commonwealth, I receive it, sir, at your hands. And I express the thanks of the Commonwealth for the precious gift. And I venture the prophecy that for countless years to come and to untold thousands these mute pages shall eloquently speak of high resolve, great suffering, and heroic endurance made possible by an absolute faith in the overruling providence of Almighty God. So it's been at home since 1897. And that original Bradford manuscript, or referred today as History of Plimoth Plantation by William Bradford, now resides in a protective vault deep inside the Massachusetts State House Library. It is rarely taken out of the vault for viewing due to its fragility and great worth to our nation. Photocopies of it have been made for public viewing. Most recently, it was brought out for a short time for the production of the documentary The Pilgrims that was featured on PBS's American Experience program in November 2016. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that it was truly God's providential hand that guided the intrepid pilgrims to the shores of Massachusetts, gave Governor Bradford wherewithal to chronicle that history, and to ensure that it was protected from fire, flood, and war, only to be returned after 120 years of being lost to where it belongs, home to the shores of Massachusetts. Thank you.